So in this video, we're going to be practicing graphing equations using a table of values, what is commonly called a t-chart. And so let's look at the first example here. We have y equals x plus 5. And if you see, this chart is already filled out with the x values -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. And in this video, we're going to only use those 5 values for x in all the examples we do. So this chart here has a middle column that shows the equation, like the function part of the equation, x plus 5. So we're going to take each of these x values and add 5 to them, because that's what the equation says to do, to get our y values. So -2 plus 5, -1 plus 5, 0 plus 5, 1 plus 5, and 2 plus 5. And so what that will give us, for -2, that's 3. For -1, that's 4. 0 is 5. 1 is 6. And 2 is 7. So what we've done is create ordered pairs, -2, 3, and so on, that we can now use to graph this equation on the coordinate plane. So -2, 3, left 2, up 3, and then -1, 4, 0, 5, 1, 6, and 2, 7. And there you have the line. So the basics here, we're going to plug in values of x into the equation to get corresponding values of y, and then you can use those ordered pairs to graph each equation in these notes. Now, for simple ones like this, x minus 2, and even the first one, you can probably get away with skipping this middle column. And you can see why it's called a t-chart, because when you make the actual chart, use the lowercase letter t, x and y, and that's all you need. Again, we're going to use these 5 values for x. And now when you don't have the middle column like we did here, you kind of have to do this in your head or using a calculator, but you just won't be writing it down. So we're going to take each value for x here and subtract 2. So -2 minus 2, that's -4. -1 minus 2 is -3. 0 minus 2 is -2. 1 minus 2 is -1. And 2 minus 2 is 0. And now we can graph these points on the coordinate plane. -2, -4, left 2, down 4. -1, -3, left 1, down 3. 0, -2, 1, -1, and 2, 0. Now, because we're setting these up with the same 5 points every time, -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2, which are all the same distance apart, the y values here will form a pattern, and it will correspond to the number in front of x every time. So here they're increasing by 1, and you can see we have a 1 in front of the x in the equation. So that's just something you can use for now to make sure you're doing this correctly. We'll get into why that number has that effect in a later section of notes. Now, for example C, this is a slightly more complicated equation. So I would recommend using the full chart like this, writing this portion here, 2x minus 4, and that way you can have somewhere to write down your work to make sure you're doing these things correctly. But keep in mind, we're going to be replacing this x with all these numbers here. So what you can do is sort of leave the parentheses for that, and that way you can be sure you're writing down the same function each time. So we're going to plug in -2 here, -1 here, 0, 1, and 2. So basically we're just replacing x in this equation with all these x values here and finding their corresponding y values. So -2, we do 2 times -2, which is -4, minus 4 is -8. 2 times -1 is -2, minus 4 is -6. 2 times 0 is 0, minus 4 is -4. 2 times 1 is 2, minus 4 is -2. And 2 times 2 is 4, minus 4 is 0. And if you look at the pattern here, they're increasing by 2 each time, which again is the number in front of the x in the equation. So again, you can use that to check your work as you go, just to kind of make sure they're all in order. They should make a pattern. If one doesn't, you know you probably did some math wrong. Likewise, when you actually graph these points over here, -2, -8, when you graph them over here, if one of them is out of line, you'll know that you did something wrong there as well. So you should use all of this stuff, the list, the table, the graph, all these things you can use to make sure you're doing these steps correctly, because they should all work out the same. You should have a straight line on the graph, and your numbers should form a pattern which matches this number in the table. Okay, so there you have example C. Let's go on to example D. Same thing, a little more complicated. I've got 2 steps, so just to be safe, I recommend putting in this middle column, although you don't really need to, just if it helps. Okay, so let's plug in those x values. We got -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2. So let's do some math. -3 times -2 is +6, plus 1 is 7. -3 times -1 is +3, plus 1 is 4. -3 times 0 is 0, plus 1 is 1. -3 times 1 is -3, plus 1 is -2. -3 times 2 is -6, plus 1 is -5. Once again, you can see these do form a pattern. We're going down 3. This is a -3, so it matches up. Let's graph. -2, 7, left 2, up 7. -1, 4, 0, 1, 1, -2, and 2, -5. Draw your line. Doesn't have to be perfect. As long as your points are in the right spot, you should be okay. I'm just trying to make it look semi-decent. Okay, there's example D. Let's go on to example E. Here's a little bit of a simpler one, so let's just do our 2-column chart, a true T-chart here. Same 5 values for x, though. Now, technically, you can use any numbers for x, but in this video, we're just going to use these 5. They're the 5 in the middle. They're the smallest numbers to use. They're just kind of the easiest ones. Now, this negative here is going to change the sign of anything I put in there. So, -2 becomes +2, plus 7 is 9. -1 becomes +1, plus 7 is 8. 0 plus 7 is 7. And now put in 1, it becomes -1 plus 7 is 6. And then we get 5 for 2. So -2, 9 is here, -1, 8, 0, 7, 1, 6, 2, 5. And there's your line there. Let's move on to example F. Let's just do a two-column chart here. Even though it's a 2-step, I think we can do it. But I definitely recommend using that middle column if you feel like it's easier for you to make sure you get the steps right. Definitely fill in that middle column for these. So 2x minus 6, we're going to do 2 times -2, that's -4. Minus 6 is -10. 2 times -1 is -2. Minus 6 is -8. 0 minus 6 is -6. 1 times 2 is 2, minus 6 is -4. And 2 times 2 is 4, minus 6 is -2. So again, we're just plugging those values in here for x, multiplying by 2, and then subtracting 6. So let's graph these points, -2, -10. Now, -2, -10 is off the graph a little bit, so you can either just skip it, or you can kind of estimate where it is. If it was really far off the graph, I'd recommend just not graphing it. You can just do the next one. Just do the ones that are actually on the graph. -1, -8 is here. 0, -6. 1, -4, and 2, -2. And there's our last straight line of the notes. So basic concept, use the values -2, -1, 0, 1, and 2 for x. Build your t-charts, plug in those values into the equation for x, work through the operations to get your values for y, plot those points on the graph. They should be in a straight line, and the y values should form a pattern based on the number in the equation. So all that you can use to check your work, make sure you're doing these right, and good luck.